Nobody was laughing by the time Maggie Aldren walked out of that sale barn with the paperwork in her hand, but they were laughing when she arrived. A 12-year-old girl in her grandfather's oversized canvas coat, standing at the back of a livestock auction in Marshall County, Iowa, holding a spiral notebook against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The coat hung past her knees. The sleeves had been rolled twice at the cuffs, and they were still too long, bunching around her wrists, making her hands look even smaller than they were. The notebook was old leather-covered, the kind you could buy at a farm supply store for $3, and it had been used so thoroughly that the spine was cracked and the pages had gone soft from handling. It was not hers. It had belonged to her grandfather. And it was the reason she was standing in that barn on that particular Saturday morning in October, surrounded by 90 grown men who did not know her name and would not have cared to learn it. In front of her in pen 6 stood a Hereford bull that everyone had already written off. A bull the regulars had spent the better part of the morning calling a lost cause. A bull she had come there specifically to buy. It was the second Saturday of October 2016. The harvest was mostly in across central Iowa. The corn stubble outside the sale barn in Marshalltown was dry and pale gold, under a low, overcast sky stretching flat in every direction, the way the land does in that part of the state where you can see the curve of the earth if you stand still long enough and the air is clean. The temperature was somewhere around 41 degrees. There was a wind coming off the fields that carried dust and diesel and the faint ammonia of a barn that had been running cattle through it since 5 in the morning. The kind of wind that finds the gaps in your clothing and settles there cold and patient, reminding you that winter was not far behind. The sale barn itself sat low against the sky like something that had grown out of the ground rather than been built on top of it. Steel siding gone the color of old pennies. A gravel lot half full of pickup trucks and stock trailers, some of them still ticking and cooling from the drive. A hand-painted sign above the entrance that read, Marshalltown Livestock Exchange. The letters faded to the point where you had to already know what they said in order to read them. The building had been there for over 40 years. It smelled like it. It sounded like it. The clang of steel gates, the low bellowing of cattle moving through the alley system behind the ring, the static crackle of the PA system warming up the murmur of men who had known each other for decades gathering in the same place they gathered every month to do the same thing they had always done. The auction that day was what they called a reduction sale. A cattleman named Dwight Everett, 73 years old, was retiring. He had run a cow-calf operation on the same 320 acres for 46 years, longer than most of the men in the barn had been alive, and he was selling off the last of his breeding stock. 64 head in total, along with 3 bulls. It was the kind of sale that drew attention in the cattle community, not because the prices would be exceptional, but because Dwight Everett was known as a careful, honest breeder, and his stock carried the weight of that reputation. The sale had drawn about 90 registered bidders. Some had come from as far as Nebraska and southern Minnesota, driving 3 or 4 hours on 2-lane highways through the flat, stubbled landscape of the upper Midwest to be there. Most were men in their 50s and 60s. Insulated coveralls and feed store caps, paper bidder numbers, and styrofoam cups of coffee that had gone lukewarm in their hands. They stood along the rails of the sale ring and leaned against the steel panels of the holding pens and talked in the low, unhurried voices of men who have spent their lives doing physical work and have learned that conversation is something you do with your hands in your pockets and your eyes on something else. There were maybe 4 women in the crowd. Wives mostly who had come along for the draw and were sitting in the bleacher seats above the ring with their coats zipped up and their arms crossed, waiting for the sale to finish so they could stop for lunch on the way home. There was 1 child. Maggie arrived in the passenger seat of a 1998 Ford F250 driven by her Uncle Dex, who owned a small feedlot 2 counties over. The truck was 15 years old and the passenger door stuck, and Maggie had to push it with her shoulder to get it open, bracing her boots on the running board and shoving until the latch released with a metallic groan. She dropped to the gravel lot and pulled the coat tighter around herself and looked at the sale barn the way a person looks at a building they have been thinking about for a very long time. Dex came around the front of the truck. He was Walt's younger brother, though the family resemblance was subtle. Where Walt had been quiet and deliberate, Dex was quieter still, the kind of man who could go half a day without speaking and not notice the silence. He was in his late 50s, lean-weathered, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking across open ground into bright light. He reached into the cab and pulled out a paper bidder number. 47. He clipped it to the front of Maggie's coat the way you pin a name tag on a child at church, carefully making sure it was straight, and then he looked at her for a long moment. "I brought you," he said. "I won't bid for you. That was the deal." She nodded. "I'll be inside if you need me." She nodded again. She did not say thank you. She did not say she was nervous or excited or afraid. She stood there in the gravel lot with the wind pulling at her coat and the notebook pressed against her chest, and she watched her uncle walk toward the entrance, his boots crunching on the gravel, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders set against the cold. Then she walked in. The concrete aisles had been hosed down and the floor was still wet, in places dark and shining under the overhead fluorescent lights. The lights themselves were the industrial kind, long tubes in metal housings, and they cast a flat, colorless illumination that made everything in the barn look slightly more worn than it actually was. The sale ring was at the center of the building, a steel-railed oval with tiered seating on three sides and the auctioneer's box elevated at the far end like a pulpit. The seats were metal folding chairs bolted to risers, and most of them were occupied. Men were leaning on the rails around the ring, talking low, laughing, occasionally at something someone said. The kind of laughter that comes from familiarity rather than humor. These men had been coming to sales together for 20, 30, 40 years. They knew each other's operations, each other's preferences, each other's bidding habits. They knew who was buying and who was looking and who was there just to get out of the house. It was a community as insular and codified as any private club, and it operated on the same unspoken rules. You earned your place by showing up year after year and doing the work. A few of them looked at Maggie as she walked in. Not many. She was small and quiet, and the coat made her look even smaller, and in a barn full of large men in heavy clothing, she was easy to overlook. One man near the rail nudged the man beside him and said something too low to hear. Another man, louder, with the broad, red-cheeked face of someone who enjoyed an audience, said somebody's granddaughter got lost. There was a ripple of chuckles. Not cruel exactly, just the sound of grown men finding it unusual, maybe mildly amusing, that a child was walking the pens with a bidder number clipped to her coat. It was the same sound you might hear if a dog wandered into a church service, a gentle disruption of the expected order of things. Maggie did not react. She did not look up. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She walked past the first three pens without stopping, past the heifers shifting and blowing in their enclosures, past a cluster of men debating the merits of a young bull in pen 4 with the careful circling language of men who are interested but do not want to appear interested. She walked with the kind of focus that in an adult would have been recognized immediately as purpose. In a child, it was invisible. She stopped at pen 6. The bull in pen 6 was a 6-year-old registered Hereford, tagged and papered, weighing somewhere around 1,900 pounds. His name in the catalog was Everett Redwood 412. He had a deep red coat, white face thick through the chest and loin, with the kind of frame that suggested good genetics and careful management. His head was broad and his eyes were calm, and he stood in the pen with the heavy, settled presence of a mature bull who had been well cared for and well fed and had lived a life of routine and purpose, except that he was limping. It was the front left, a slight favoring that showed when he shifted his weight, which he did often, rocking gently to the right and holding there for a moment before shifting back. It was the kind of limp that to a casual observer might have gone unnoticed, but to anyone who worked with cattle, it was unmistakable. Something was wrong with that foot, something that made every step uncomfortable enough to avoid. Word had already gone through the barn the way it always does in that kind of place, quickly, quietly, through the informal network of sidelong glances and murmured assessments that constitute the real information exchange at any livestock sale. The bull was lame, maybe foot rot, maybe a navicular issue, maybe something structural and permanent, a deterioration of the coffin bone or a ligament that had given way under 1,900 pounds of daily use. Nobody knew for certain because nobody had examined him closely enough to determine the cause. They had simply seen the limp and drawn the logical conclusion. Dwight Everett, the owner, had listed the bull anyway. He had listed him because Dwight was honest and because he had been selling cattle for 46 years, and he understood that an honest catalog is the only thing a cattleman has that outlasts his operation. He was not going to pull an animal from his own retirement sale. He was not going to pretend the limp did not exist. He had listed the bull with a note in the catalog that said, "Slight lameness, front left cause undetermined," and he had left it to the buyers to decide what that meant. The buyers had already decided, a lame bull at 6 years old with unknown cause. That was a bull headed to slaughter. You might get meat price for him, maybe 90 cents a pound on the hoof. 1,900 pounds at 90 cents came out to about $1,700. That was the ceiling as far as anyone in the barn was concerned. And $1,700 for a registered Hereford bull with good bloodlines and a proven breeding record was a tragedy. But it was also to every experienced buyer in that room the reality. Maggie climbed up on the second rail of the pen. Slowly, carefully, she hooked her boots on the lower bar and rested her arms on the top rail, and she positioned herself so that her eyes were level with the bull's shoulder. She was close enough to hear him breathe, close enough to see the faint steam rising from his nostrils in the cold air of the barn, close enough to smell him, the deep, earthy, particular smell of a Hereford bull grain and grass, and the warm, musky undertone of an animal in good health. She watched him for a long time. She watched how he breathed. She watched the rhythm of it, the expansion of his rib cage, the way his flanks moved in and out with the slow, even cadence of an animal that was not in distress. She watched the angle of his pasterns, the joints just above the hooves, looking for swelling, for heat, for the subtle asymmetry that would indicate a structural problem. She watched the set of his shoulders, whether they were even, whether one was carried higher than the other, to compensate for pain below. She watched the way the hair was worn on the front of his left hoof, the pattern of abrasion that told a story about how the foot was being placed, how the weight was being distributed, how long the problem had been going on. She took the notebook out of her coat pocket. She opened it to a page that already had writing on it. Not her writing. Her grandfather's writing, small and precise and slightly slanted to the right, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write with a fountain pen and had never fully adjusted to ballpoints. She studied the page for a moment, comparing what was written there to what she was seeing in front of her. Then she took a pencil from her pocket and added her own notes beneath his. She held up her hand flat in front of her face, measuring something with her thumb against the distance the way a person sights a fence line or estimates the height of a tree. She was measuring the angle of the limp, the degree of deviation from a normal stride, the specific way the bull's foot met the ground and the specific way it left it. She was reading the limp the way a musician reads a sheet of music, not just the notes, but the tempo, the dynamics, the spaces between. She climbed down. She walked around to the far side of the pen, stepping over a puddle of wash water on the concrete floor, and she watched the bull from there for another 4 or 5 minutes. She watched him from a different angle, seeing different things the way the same sentence means something different when you read it twice. She wrote more things down. She was thorough. She was patient. She was 12 years old, and she was doing something that most of the men in that barn had stopped doing 20 years ago, which was looking at an animal as if the looking itself was the point. Then she closed the notebook and put it back in her coat and stood very still with her hands at her sides, looking at the bull, the way some people look at a painting in a museum. Not studying it anymore, just seeing it, seeing the whole of it. The red coat and the white face and the broad, calm head and the slight rhythmic rocking as he shifted his weight from the sore foot to the sound one, back and forth, like a metronome counting time. A man named Curtis Wainwright, who ran a 300-cow operation west of Tama, was standing in the coffee area with a styrofoam cup in his hand. He was 66 years old, tall, loose-jointed, with a face that had been weathered by decades of Iowa wind into something that looked like it had been carved from hardwood. He had been watching the girl since she walked in. Not with any particular interest at first, just the idle curiosity of a man with time to kill before the lots he cared about came up for sale. Then he realized she was taking notes, and that was when he set his coffee down and started paying attention. He told people, later told them more than once, in the careful, unhurried way that men of his generation tell stories that have stayed with them, that the thing that caught his eye was not the notebook. It was her stillness. He said she stood at that pen with the kind of focused calm that most people never achieve in their entire lives, the kind that comes not from trying to be still, but from being so completely absorbed in what you are doing that everything else simply ceases to exist. He said he had seen that kind of stillness exactly once before in a man named Walt Aldren, who had been his neighbor for 30 years. Maggie had learned cattle from her grandfather. His name was Walt Aldren. He had kept 40 head of registered Herefords on a small place outside Gladbrook his entire adult life, and he had been by most accounts one of the better stockmen in that part of the county. Not famous, not wealthy, not the kind of man who won awards or gave speeches or had his picture in the livestock journals. Just steady, careful, and quiet, the way that men who work with animals for 50 years become quiet. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to people who spend their days in the company of creatures that do not speak, a silence that is not empty, but full of observation, full of attention, full of the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from watching the same kinds of things happen over and over again until you begin to see the patterns beneath the patterns, the meaning beneath the behavior, the truth beneath the surface. Walt Aldren had that silence. He wore it the way he wore his canvas coat, easily, naturally, as if it had been fitted to him a long time ago, and he had simply grown into it. He had hands like old leather brown and cracked and strong, with knuckles that had been broken and healed and broken again over decades of physical work. He had a voice that never rose above the level of a conversation, not because he lacked the ability to raise it, but because he had never found a reason to. Cattle do not respond to volume. They respond to calm. Walt had learned that lesson early and had never forgotten it. He had taken Maggie with him to auctions from the time she could walk. From the time she was 2 years old, sitting in the cab of his truck in a car seat, watching the world go by through the windshield as they drove the county roads to sales in Grundy Center and Eldora and Marshalltown and Tama. He had carried her on his hip through sale barns when she was too small to see over the rails, lifting her up so she could look at the animals, pointing at their feet, their shoulders, their heads, their eyes, explaining things to her in a low, steady voice that never condescended, never simplified, never assumed she was too young to understand. He taught her to read a bull's feet before she learned long division. He taught her the difference between a limp that meant something serious and a limp that meant nothing at all. He taught her that most buyers look at a bull for 90 seconds and decide. 90 seconds of looking, and then a judgment that carries the weight of thousands of dollars. He taught her that 90 seconds was not enough, that you could not understand an animal in 90 seconds any more than you could understand a person in 90 seconds, and that the men who thought they could were not as good at this as they believed they were. He taught her to watch the way an animal gets up from lying down, because that is the hardest thing for a bull with a real structural problem to do. The act of rising, of shifting 1,900 pounds from horizontal to vertical, of loading the joints and tendons and bones with the full force of gravity after a period of rest, that is the moment when structural weakness reveals itself. A bull with a sound skeleton gets up clean and steady, pushing off with his hind legs and rocking forward onto his front end in one fluid motion. A bull with a structural problem hesitates. He shifts, he tries one way and then another. He gets halfway up and pauses, rearranging his weight, looking for a way to stand that does not hurt. If you watch that moment, Walt had told her, you will know more about that animal than his pedigree papers will ever tell you. He taught her with patience and repetition the way a man teaches something he believes matters. He never once told her she was too young to understand. He never once simplified what he knew. He gave it to her straight, the way he gave it to every animal he worked with, every person he dealt with, every task he undertook. Respect first, then attention, then the slow accumulation of knowing. And she had listened. She had listened the way children listen when they know instinctively that what they are being told is important. Not with the performative attention of a student trying to please a teacher, but with the genuine, deep, absorptive attention of someone whose mind is being shaped by what it hears. She had listened, and she had watched, and she had written things down in the notebook. He gave her a smaller version of his own, and over the years, her handwriting had grown more precise, and her observations had grown more detailed, and her ability to see what other people missed had grown from a child's curiosity into something that looked to anyone paying attention like genuine skill. Walt Aldren died of pancreatic cancer in March of that year, 7 months before the Everett sale. He was 71 years old, and he went the way the disease usually takes a person. Quickly, without negotiation, without mercy. The diagnosis came in January. By February, he was in a hospital bed that his daughter Sandra had set up in the living room of the farmhouse, because the hospital was 40 minutes away, And Walt had said in one of the last full sentences he spoke with any force that he was not going to die in a building he had never slept in before. Maggie sat beside him every afternoon after school. She sat in a wooden chair that she had pulled up to the side of the bed close enough to reach his hand if she wanted to, and she read to him from the livestock journals he had subscribed to for 30 years. She read him market reports and breeding records and the small detailed articles about herd management and genetic selection that he had spent his life studying. She read them in a quiet, steady voice, and sometimes he was awake and listening, and sometimes he was asleep, and she read to him anyway because the sound of the information was a comfort to both of them, a thread that connected the world he was leaving to the world she was going to have to navigate without him. He left her two things. The first was the notebook, the one he had kept for 31 years. It was the record of a life's work written in a hand that grew shakier toward the end, but never less precise. Pedigrees and weights and dates and the small observations that stockmen collect over a lifetime. The subtle language of hooves and shoulders and the way a bull carries his head when something is wrong and the way he carries it when he is sound. It was not organized in any formal way. It was not indexed or categorized. It was simply the ongoing daily practice of a man who believed that paying attention to the world and writing down what you saw was the most important thing a person could do. 31 years of that practice compressed into a cracked leather cover and 312 pages of fading ink. The second thing he left her was $4,200 in a savings account. It was not a large amount of money by any standard. It was the remnant of a lifetime of modest earnings, carefully saved, deliberately preserved, set aside not for a rainy day, but for a specific purpose that Walt had understood even if he had never explicitly stated it. He had told Sandra, his daughter, about the account, and Sandra had agreed reluctantly, with the particular reluctance of a practical woman who sees her father's romantic ideas about cattle and farming being passed to her daughter like a genetic trait she had hoped would skip a generation, that Maggie could use the money one time on one animal if she wanted to try. The last page Walt had written on was dated January 14th, 2 months before he died. It was different from the other pages in the notebook. It was not a record of an animal he had seen. It was not a weight or a pedigree or an observation about foot structure. It was a note, brief and plain, written in a hand that was already beginning to betray the illness that was consuming him, the letter slightly larger than usual, slightly more spaced, as if he was being very careful to make sure they could be read. It said, "Everett Reduction Sale October. Redwood 412 out of the 308 cow. Good line, sound pedigree, watch the feet." That was all. No instructions, no explanation, no sentiment, no message of love or farewell or guidance. Just the information. Because Walt Aldren had always believed that if you give someone the right information and they are paying attention, they will know what to do with it. He had spent 31 years proving that with cattle. He had spent 12 years proving it with his granddaughter. Maggie found the note in April, a month after the funeral. She had been reading through the notebook the way you read a letter from someone who is gone, slowly, carefully turning each page as if it might be the last one, hearing his voice in the words, seeing his hand in the handwriting, feeling the weight of his presence in the precise, unhurried observations he had recorded about animals that were long since sold or slaughtered or dead of old age. The notebook was a record of the world as Walt Aldren had seen it, and reading it was like looking through his eyes one more time. When she reached the last page, she stopped. She read the note once. She read it again. She sat on the edge of her bed in the small room she had slept in her entire life, with the notebook open in her lap and the afternoon light coming through the window and the sound of her mother moving around downstairs in the kitchen, and she did not move for a long time. She had spent the next 2 months researching. She found the Everett sale listing online on a livestock auction website that listed upcoming sales across the Midwest. She read the catalog entry for Redwood 412. She read the pedigree tracing the bloodlines back 3 generations, the way her grandfather had taught her to do, looking for the markers of quality that distinguished a breeding animal from a commercial one. She cross-referenced the cow line against state fair records and found that the 308 cow Redwoods dam had produced 3 state fair champions over a 12-year period. 3 champions from 1 cow was exceptional. It meant the genetics were not merely good, but consistently good, which is a much harder thing to achieve and a much more valuable thing to possess. She calculated the genetic value of a sound breeding bull from that line. She used the methods her grandfather had taught her, comparing recent sales of bulls with similar pedigrees, adjusting for age, for condition, for the current market. She came up with a number between $9,000 and $10,000. She wrote it down in the notebook beneath her grandfather's last entry in handwriting that was neater than his but carried the same careful precision. Then she called her Uncle Dex and asked him to drive her out to the Everett place to look at the bull. Dex did not ask why. Dex was not the kind of man who asked why when a member of his family wanted to look at cattle. He said he would pick her up Saturday morning, and he did. He took her twice. Both times she spent over an hour watching Redwood 412. The first time they drove out on a Saturday morning in August, when the pastures were green and thick, and the bull was grazing in a field with two other animals, moving slowly through the grass, tearing off mouthfuls with the rhythmic, unhurried efficiency of a healthy ruminant. Maggie sat on the fence and watched him walk on grass. She watched the way his hooves sank into the soft ground, the way the guive of the soil masked the limp, making it harder to see, but not impossible if you knew what to look for. The second time, 2 weeks later, she watched him walk on concrete. Dex had arranged with Dwight Everett to bring the bull into the working pens, where the footing was hard and flat, and every imperfection in a stride was amplified by the unyielding surface. On concrete, the limp was obvious. The front left foot came down with a hesitation, a fractional shortening of the stride, as if the bull was trying to get the weight off it as quickly as possible. Maggie watched from 5 different angles. She knelt on the concrete and studied the front left hoof from 6 inches away, while the bull stood calm above her, breathing slow and deep, the way Herefords do when they have decided you are not a threat. She watched him get up from lying down. This was the test her grandfather had taught her, was the most important one, the one that separated a hoof problem from a bone problem, a temporary condition from a permanent one. Dex had the bull penned in a small area with deep straw bedding, and they waited patiently for over 30 minutes until the bull lay down to rest. Then they waited again another 20 minutes until he decided to rise. He got up clean. He pushed off with his hind legs rocked forward onto his front end and stood in one fluid motion without hesitation, without shifting, without the telltale pause that would have indicated pain in the joints or bones of his front legs. The limp was there when he walked, but the act of rising was smooth and effortless, and Maggie wrote in her notebook in letters she underlined, "Twice rises clean, no structural involvement." And she had figured out something that none of the 90 people in that barn on sale day had bothered to figure out. The limp was not structural, it was a hoof abscess. A hoof abscess, if you have never seen one, is a pocket of infection that forms inside the hoof wall. It develops when bacteria enter through a crack or a puncture in the sole or the white line of the hoof, and it creates a small pressurized cavity of fluid and pus between the sensitive tissue of the foot and the hard outer wall. It is extraordinarily painful. The pressure inside the hoof wall is constant and intense, and every step drives the weight of the animal down onto that pocket of pain. The result is a pronounced limp, a deep, obvious favoring of the affected foot that looks to an untrained eye, or even to a trained eye that is in a hurry, like the beginning of something much worse. Navicular disease, ring bone, a tendon injury, a fracture, any of the conditions that end a breeding bull's career and reduce a $10,000 animal to $1,700 of meat on the hoof. But a hoof abscess, when it is actually a hoof abscess, is one of the most curable conditions that can happen to a bull. You trim the hoof, you find the pocket, you open it with a hoof knife and release the pressure. You drain the infection. You wrap the foot in a clean bandage with an antiseptic poultice. You put the animal in a dry, clean pen with good footing and fresh bedding. You wait 10 days, maybe 12, and then he walks sound again. Total cost, maybe $60 in supplies and $140 for the vet. 2 weeks of patience, 2 weeks of changing bandages and keeping the pen clean and watching the animal improve day by day, step by step, until the limp is gone and the bull walks the way he was always meant to walk, solid and even and sound. Maggie had spotted it because Walt had taught her to spot it. The hair pattern on the hoof wall, which was rubbed in a specific way that indicated the bull was landing on the outside of the hoof to avoid pressure on the inside where an abscess would be. The way the bull carried his head tilted just slightly to the left, compensating for the pain below, and to the right a compensation pattern that was characteristic of hoof pain rather than joint pain. The specific angle of the limp itself, which was deeper than a joint problem, would produce but shorter in duration between steps, meaning the pain was sharp and localized rather than dull and diffuse. She had written it all down. She had a 4-page entry in her notebook on this one bull. 4 pages of her handwriting underneath 31 years of his. She had also written down the pedigree, the dam's production record, the sire's EPDs, the estimated breeding value, and the market comparables for sound bulls of similar quality. She had done the work. She had done it with the thoroughness and precision that her grandfather had taught her, and she had done it alone, without guidance, without a mentor, without anyone to check her work or confirm her conclusions. She had known what she was going to do before she ever bought the bidder number. She had known since April, sitting on the edge of her bed, reading the last thing her grandfather had ever written down. Watch the feet. She had watched the feet. She had watched them more carefully than anyone in that barn, more carefully than Dwight Everett himself, more carefully than the 90 experienced cattlemen who would file past pen 6 on sale day and glance at the limping bull and shake their heads and move on. She had watched the feet, and she had seen what was there, and she had written it down, and she had come to buy. The auction started at 10. The auctioneer was a man named Bob Teasley from Newton, 38 years in the business, with a voice that could fill the barn without amplification, though he used a microphone anyway. The microphone was mounted on a flexible arm in the auctioneer's box, and Teasley leaned into it with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the better part of 4 decades turning numbers into rhythm. A good auctioneer does not simply call prices. He creates a tempo. He builds a momentum. He reads the room the way a conductor reads an orchestra, sensing when to push and when to pause, when to raise the energy and when to let it settle. And he uses his voice as an instrument, varying pitch and speed and volume to keep the bidders engaged and the prices climbing. The heifers went first. They moved through the ring in lots of 3 and 4 young animals with wide eyes and nervous steps, and the bidding was steady and unremarkable. The prices were what you would expect for good heifers in a quiet market. Fair, but not exciting. The cow-calf pairs came next, mothers and their calves sold as a unit, and these brought slightly more interest from the crowd. A man from Hardin County bought 4 pairs at prices that drew approving nods from the men along the rail. That was good money for good stock. The pace was steady. Teasley kept it moving. Lot after lot, the animals came through the ring, were assessed, were bid on, were sold, and were let out the back gate to the pens where the buyers' trailers were waiting. The rhythm of it was ancient and familiar, the same rhythm that had governed livestock sales in this part of the world for over a century. Animals and money, and the voices of men doing business in the way their fathers and grandfathers had done business before them. Around 1140, they brought in the first of the 3 bulls. Everett Redbud, 388, a clean 4-year-old with no issues, well-conformed, bright-eyed, the kind of bull that makes buyers sit up in their seats. The bidding was brisk. He sold for $4,900 to a buyer from Osceola, a man in a brown Carhartt jacket who raised his number with the confident, minimal gesture of someone who has bought many bulls and does not need to make a production of it. The crowd murmured its approval. That was a fair price, maybe even a good one, and it reflected well on Dwight Everett's program. The second bull, Everett Ranger 401, was a 5-year-old with excellent EPDs and a calm disposition. He sold for $5,600 to the same buyer from Osceola. The crowd murmured again. 2 good bulls, 2 good prices. The sale was going well. Then they brought Redwood 412 into the ring. You could hear the shift, not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound. The leaning in stopped. Men who had been pressed against the rails, shoulders forward, eyes tracking the animal with the focused attention of potential buyers, settled back. The change was subtle but unmistakable. It was the collective withdrawal of interest, the physical expression of a decision that had already been made. This one was not worth their time. A few men checked their phones. Some turned to talk to the person beside them, dropping their voices to the conversational murmur that serves as background noise at any sale. Someone in the 3rd row, a heavy-set man with a feed store cap pushed back on his head, made a low joke about hamburger. A couple of men near him chuckled. The energy in the barn went flat the way air goes flat before a storm, except there was no storm coming. There was just a limping bull in a room full of men who had already made up their minds. Teasley up in the auctioneer's box read the catalog entry quickly. The registered name, the sire, the dam, the weight, the age, and then the note's slight lameness, front left cause undetermined. He read it the way you read a weather forecast for a day you are not planning to go outside. Factually, without investment. Then he said in the mild, honest voice that auctioneers use when they already know a lot is not going to bring much. All right, let's see what we've got on this one. Who'll start me at 2,000? Nobody moved. The barn was still, not tense, just empty of intention. $2,000 for a lame bull was more than anyone was prepared to offer, and the silence said so more clearly than words. 1,500. Nobody moved. All right, let's start where we can. 1,000 anybody. Give me 1,000. A beat of quiet. Then in the back of the barn near the coffee area, a hand went up. A man raised his paper bidder number with the practiced, unhurried motion of someone who does this for a living. Hank Purcell, meat buyer from Cedar Rapids. He was 58 years old, built like a fence post, thick through the chest and narrow everywhere else, with a face that had been set into an expression of permanent calculation. He bought cattle for slaughter the way some men buy used cars. He knew the margins. He knew the numbers. He was there for exactly this kind of animal, the ones no one else wanted, the ones that were already in every experienced mind in the room, headed for the processing floor. 1,000 I've got, 1,100. Purcell took it up slowly, bidding against himself in the empty air. 1,100, 1,150, 12. The numbers climbed without competition the way they do when everyone in the room has already decided the outcome and is just waiting for the paperwork. Teasley called the bids with the efficient, slightly bored cadence of an auctioneer. Running down a one-sided sale, his voice still rhythmic, but the energy behind it diminished the way a motor sounds when it is running, but not under load. At 12:50, Teasley was winding down. He had the gavel in his hand. The lot was about to close at a price that would give Purcell his margin and send Redwood 412 to a processing plant in Cedar Rapids, where he would be reduced to his component parts and sold by the pound. In the genetics, he carried the 3 state fair champions in his pedigree. The decades of careful breeding that had produced him would cease to exist. Then a small, clear voice from the rail said 1,500. Teasley paused. His hand, which had been moving toward the gavel, stopped in midair. He leaned forward in the box, craning his neck to see over the heads of the men in the front row, trying to locate the source of the bid. The voice had been too high to be a man's, too clear to be old, too steady to be uncertain. He saw a girl in an oversized coat standing at the rail with her hand raised, holding up a paper bidder number. 47. Her hand was steady. Her face was calm. She was looking directly at the auctioneer, making eye contact the way a bidder is supposed to, the way a serious bidder does. Teasley smiled. It was an automatic smile, the kind of smile that appears on a person's face when something unexpected and mildly charming interrupts the routine. The way you smile at a child at a county fair who has just done something precocious. He adjusted the microphone and said with warmth and a touch of amusement, "Well, all right, young lady, 1,500. Is that your dad bidding?" Maggie looked up at him. She looked up at him across the sawdust floor of the sale ring, across the steel rails and the fluorescent lights, in the faces of 90 men who were now turning toward her with expressions that ranged from amusement to confusion to mild concern. She looked up at him with the steady, level gaze that Walt Aldren had spent 12 years teaching her was the most important tool a person could possess. The ability to look at something directly without flinching, without looking away, without breaking eye contact, and to say what you see. "No, sir," she said. Her voice carried across the barn the way a clear bell carries across an open field. Level, unhesitating, without a tremor in it. "That's me." There was laughter. It moved through the barn in a wave, row by row, seat by seat, the way laughter does in a crowd when something catches people off guard. It was not mean laughter. Not exactly. It was the laughter of surprise, of incongruity, of a large group of people suddenly confronted with something they did not expect and do not know how to process. A 12-year-old girl bidding on a bull at a livestock auction. It was amusing. It was unusual. It was, to most of the men in that barn, slightly absurd. Heads turned. Men nudged each other. Someone near the back in the 3rd or 4th row of the bleacher seats said loud enough for 20 people to hear, Oh, this ought to be good. There was more laughter, the kind of laughter that feeds on itself, that multiplies as it moves through a crowd, each person's amusement amplified by the amusement of the person next to them. And in the coffee area, Curtis Wainwright set his styrofoam cup down on the metal table and did not pick it up again. Hank Purcell was not a man who lost auctions. He had been buying cattle for slaughter for over 30 years. He knew every sale barn within 200 miles of Cedar Rapids. He knew the auctioneers, the regulars, the sellers. He knew the rhythms and the rituals and the unspoken rules. He knew which animals were worth fighting for and which ones were already his the moment they walked into the ring. Redwood 412 was supposed to be the second kind. A lame bull at the end of a retirement sale, no competition, meat price, in and out. He looked at the girl at the rail. He looked at the number clipped to her coat. He looked at the auctioneer who was still smiling. Then he raised his number. 1,600. Maggie did not hesitate. 17. There was no pause between his bid and hers. No gap. No moment of consideration. The number came out of her mouth with the same steady clarity that had characterized everything she had done since she walked into the barn. $1,700, as if she had been rehearsing it, as if the number had been waiting in her throat. 1,800, 19, 2,000, 2,100. The laughter in the barn had begun to thin, not because anyone had changed their mind about the bull, not because anyone had suddenly realized that the girl might know something they did not. The laughter was thinning because the thing that was happening in the ring was no longer fitting the shape of a joke. Jokes have a certain trajectory. They build, they peak, they resolve. The child bids on the bull. Everyone laughs. The child is gently informed that this is not how things work. The auction continues. That was the shape the crowd was expecting. But the girl was not following the shape. She was not backing down. She was not looking at her uncle. She was not checking with anyone. She was standing at the rail with her number in the air and her eyes on the bull, and she was bidding with the calm, measured rhythm of someone who had come into this building knowing exactly what she was going to pay. 2,200. Purcell's jaw tightened. You could see the muscles in his face change, the subtle reorganization of expression that happens when a person realizes they are in a situation they did not anticipate. He raised his number again. 2,300. 2,400. Curtis Wainwright, standing near the front, later said this was the moment he felt something shift. Not in the barn, in himself. He had been running cattle for 40 years. He had seen thousands of auctions. He had watched men bluff and bluster and bid on pride. He had watched experienced buyers chase each other into unprofitable territory because neither one was willing to be the first to put his number down. But he had never seen a 12-year-old child stand at a rail and bid on a lame bull with the kind of stillness that most grown men spend their entire lives trying to achieve and never do. She was not looking at Purcell. She was not looking at the crowd. She was not looking at the auctioneer or the bleacher seats or her uncle in the coffee area. She was watching the bull. She was watching the way Redwood 412 stood in the ring under the flat fluorescent lights, the way his weight shifted, the way his head tilted a fraction to the left, compensating for the pain in his front right, a compensation pattern so subtle that you would have to know exactly what to look for in order to see it. She was reading him. She was reading him the way her grandfather had taught her to read every animal she had ever stood beside. And whatever she was reading, it was telling her to keep going. 2,500. Purcell raised his number, but slower now. The calculation was running behind his eyes. You could see it the way you can see a machine working behind a glass panel, the gears turning, the numbers clicking into place. Meat price on this animal was about $1,700. He was already $800 over. $800 of someone else's stubbornness. $800 that would come directly out of his margin, out of the profit he had driven 2 hours to collect. 2,600. The barn had gone quiet, not the bored quiet from the start of the lot when men were checking their phones and talking to their neighbors and waiting for the thing to be over. A different quiet, an attentive quiet. The quiet of a room full of people who have realized almost simultaneously that what they are watching is not what they thought they were watching. The men along the rails were watching the girl now, really watching her. The laughter had drained away the way water drains from a low spot in a field when the ground finally absorbs it. Gone, soaked into something deeper. What was left was attention, pure, focused, undivided attention, the same kind of attention that Maggie herself was giving to the bull. The barn was watching her the way she was watching the animal. And in that moment, without anyone saying it, without anyone even thinking it consciously, the dynamic in the room had changed completely. 2,700. Purcell's voice was harder now, not louder, just harder. The way a man's voice gets when his pride has become involved in something his wallet is telling him to walk away from. 2,800. 2,900. 3,000. A murmur went through the barn. $3,000 for a lame Hereford bull. That was nearly double meat price. That was beyond any reasonable calculation for an animal that every experienced buyer in the room had dismissed. The murmur was not approval or disapproval. It was something closer to astonishment. The kind of sound a crowd makes when it witnesses something it does not understand but cannot look away from. Purcell's face changed, not anger exactly, something closer to bewilderment. He was a professional. He had margins. He had a truck outside with space for 4 animals, and every dollar over meat price on this bull was a dollar that came directly out of his operating profit. He had chased this bid further than he had ever intended to, further than he would have chased it against any adult in the barn, and the reason he had chased it was sitting right there on the surface for anyone to see. He was being outbid by a child. A 12-year-old girl in an oversized coat with a spiral notebook in her pocket and a bidder number clipped to her chest. And the part that was making his jaw tight and his eyes narrow was not the money. It was the fact that she was not flinching. 3,100. He said it fast, almost cutting off the auctioneer, pushing the price up the way you push a heavy door open when you are frustrated and tired and ready to be done with whatever is on the other side. Maggie paused. For the first time since the bidding started, she paused. It was not long, maybe 2 seconds. But in an auction ring, 2 seconds is a lifetime. Men noticed, Purcell noticed, Teasley noticed. The entire barn noticed the way a crowd notices when a tightrope walker hesitates in the middle of the wire. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the notebook. She did not take it out. She just touched it the way a person touches a talisman or a lucky coin or a photograph of someone they love. Her fingers found the worn leather cover through the canvas of the coat, and she held him there for a single beat of her heart. Then she looked at Purcell. She looked at him across the ring, across the sawdust and the steel rails and the limping bull that stood between them, and she said 3,200. Purcell shook his head. He looked at the bull. He looked at the girl. He looked at the ceiling of the barn, the way men do when they are trying to calculate whether their pride is worth more than their money, and they already know the answer. 3,300, 3,400, 3,500. Purcell said it with a sharpness that made several men flinch. Not because the number was aggressive, because the voice was. It was the voice of a man who had stopped thinking about the animal entirely and was now engaged in something that had nothing to do with cattle and everything to do with the fact that he was losing publicly, audibly in front of 90 people to a girl who should not have been there. Maggie did not react to the sharpness. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She did not check the notebook. She did not glance toward the coffee area where her uncle was standing. She looked at Hank Purcell across the ring, across the lights and the dust and the years of experience that separated them, and she said in the same clear, level voice she had used from the very beginning, the voice that had not wavered once in the last 6 minutes, 3,600. The barn went silent. Purcell stared at her. His bidder number was still in his hand, half raised, frozen in the space between intention and surrender. He held it there for 3 long seconds. 3 seconds in which the only sound in the barn was the breathing of the bull in the ring and the distant clang of a gate somewhere in the back of the building. Then he put his number down. He put it down and he looked away, and the looking away was the part that people remembered. Not the putting down, the looking away. Because it was not the gesture of a man who had made a strategic decision to withdraw from an unprofitable bid. It was the gesture of a man who had been beaten and who knew it and who could not bring himself to look at the person who had beaten him. Teasley up in the auctioneer's box let the silence hold. A good auctioneer knows when to let silence do the work. He held it for 2 beats, then 3. Then he said in a voice that had lost every trace of amusement and carried instead something that sounded like quiet respect, $3,600, going once. The barn did not move. 3,650, anybody, 3,600 going twice. Still nothing. But the quality of the nothing had changed. It was not the indifferent silence of a crowd that has given up on a lot. It was the focused, attentive silence of a crowd that is witnessing something and knows it. Every eye in the barn was on the girl in the oversized coat. Sold to bidder 47, $3,600. There was a beat of quiet, 3 or 4 seconds where the barn held its collective breath. Then the normal sounds came back. Pens clanging, men clearing their throats, the next lot being called. The machinery of the auction resuming its rhythm, the way a river resumes its flow after passing around an obstruction. The obstruction was gone. The routine continued. But something had changed, and everyone in that room could feel it, even if they could not have said exactly what it was. Something had shifted in the air of the barn, some invisible reorganization of assumptions and expectations, and the men who had been laughing 10 minutes ago were not laughing now. And the men who had been checking their phones were not checking their phones now. And the man from Grundy County, who had been leaning on the rail with his cap pushed back on his head, was standing up straight with his arms at his sides, watching the girl walk away from the rail with an expression on his face that he himself would not have been able to name. Maggie climbed down from the rail and walked through the crowd toward the office at the back of the barn. The crowd parted for her, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies where people step aside in unison and a path opens up like the Red Sea. Just slightly, just enough. Men who had been standing in the aisle shifted their weight and created a gap, turning their shoulders a fraction to let her pass the way you make room for someone who has earned the right to pass without having to ask for it. A man from Grundy County in his 60s with gray hair and a sunburned neck and the thick, calloused hands of a lifetime cattleman took off his cap as she walked by. He told someone later he did not know why he did it. He just felt like he ought to. It was an old gesture, an instinctive one, the kind of gesture that comes from a part of the brain that operates below the level of conscious thought, the part that recognizes something worthy of respect, even before the thinking mind has figured out exactly what it is. She walked past him without looking up. She walked to the office and she opened the door and she went inside. The office was a small room off the main barn, separated from the noise and the dust and the smell of cattle by a hollow core door that did not close properly. There was a metal desk and a woman behind it, middle-aged, efficient, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she handled the paperwork for every animal that sold through the barn. She had been doing it for 14 years, and she had seen everything. She had not until today seen a 12-year-old girl walk in alone to sign a bill of sale for a 1,900-pound bull. Maggie filled out the buyer's form in careful handwriting. She wrote her name. She wrote her uncle's address for the bill of sale. She wrote the amount, $3,600, nearly every dollar her grandfather had left her. The woman behind the desk watched her write, and something in her face softened some professional distance, giving way to something more personal, and she said quietly, "That's a lot of money, honey." "Yes, ma'am," Maggie said, and she kept writing. She was signing the last page when Dwight Everett appeared in the doorway. He was 73 years old, lean and weathered, with white hair cut short and hands that showed every one of his 46 years in the cattle business. The knuckles were swollen. The fingers were crooked. The skin was dark and rough and mapped with scars from barbed wire and hoof picks and the 1,000 small injuries that accumulate over a lifetime of handling animals that weigh 10 times what you do. He stood in the doorway and looked at the girl at the desk, and something moved across his face that was hard to name. Recognition, maybe, or memory, or the particular bittersweet feeling that comes from seeing something you thought was gone show up again in a form you did not expect. "You're Walt's granddaughter," he said. It was not a question. Maggie looked up from the paperwork. "Yes, sir." Dwight stepped into the office. He pulled a metal folding chair away from the wall and sat down across from her, settling into it with the careful, deliberate movements of a man whose body has been worn hard by the work it has done. He rested his hands on his knees and he looked at her, and the looking was thorough and unhurried, the way a cattleman looks at an animal he is trying to understand. "Your grandfather came out to my place in January," he said, "before he got real sick. He drove out on a Wednesday morning by himself, didn't call ahead, just showed up. He spent 2 hours looking at that bull, walked around him, watched him move, watched him from every angle, knelt down and studied his feet the way he always did, like he was reading a book that nobody else could see." Maggie's hand had stopped moving on the paper. She was listening the way her grandfather had taught her to listen, completely still. Every part of her body oriented toward the person speaking, giving every word the weight it deserved. Before he left, Dwight said, he told me something. He said, if someone comes to your sale in October and bids on this bull, let them. I asked him what he meant. He said he couldn't explain it exactly. He just said, you'll know who it is when you see them. Dwight looked through the office window at the pen where Redwood 412 was still standing visible through the dusty glass, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in that slow, rhythmic pattern. The bull was calm. He did not know what had just happened. He did not know that his life had changed in the last 30 minutes. He was just standing there being what he was. An animal. A good animal. Waiting. I didn't know what he meant then, Dwight said. He turned back to Maggie. The thing that had been moving across his face had settled now. It had resolved into something clear and recognizable. It was the look of a man who has spent his entire life around cattle and cattle people, and who recognizes when he sees it the particular quality that separates the people who are good at this from the people who are merely experienced. It is a quality that has nothing to do with age or gender or the number of years you have been doing the work. It is a quality of attention, of presence, of the willingness to look at something long enough and carefully enough that it reveals what it actually is rather than what you assume it to be. I know now, he said. He stood up. He put his cap back on. He looked at Maggie one more time, and the look carried the weight of 73 years and 46 years in the cattle business, and the memory of a man named Walt Aldren, who had driven out to his place on a Wednesday morning in January, already dying, already knowing he would not be there in October, and had spent 2 hours looking at a bull, and had left behind a single instruction that only his granddaughter would understand. Your grandfather was a good stockman, Dwight said. One of the best I ever knew. He saw things other men walked right past. He paused at the door. He turned back one more time. I expect you do too. Then he left. And Maggie sat in the metal chair in the small office at the back of the sale barn, with the bill of sale in front of her, and the pen in her hand, and the notebook in her coat pocket pressing against her ribs, and she pressed her other hand flat against the notebook through the canvas, the way you press your hand against a window when someone you love is on the other side, and she stayed like that for a long moment, feeling the cracked leather cover under her palm, feeling the weight of the pages, feeling the presence of 31 years of her grandfather's attention to the world held in that small, worn space. Then she stood up. She took the paperwork. She walked out of the office past the sale ring, where the next lot was already being called, past the men who were watching her from the corners of their eyes, past the coffee area where her Uncle Dex was standing with his hands in his pockets, his face as unreadable as it always was, and she walked out the door of the sale barn into the gray October afternoon. They trailered the bull to Dex's place that afternoon. Dex had a small feed lot 2 counties over with a clean, dry pen near the barn that would work for quarantine. He backed the trailer to the gate, and Redwood 412 walked out slowly, favoring the left front, his big red head swinging as he took in the new surroundings. The air smelled different here. Different cattle, different hay, different ground. He stood at the gate for a moment, nostrils flaring, reading the air the way animals do, gathering information through senses that humans have long since stopped relying on. Then he walked into the pen, stepping carefully on the packed earth, and found the water trough. Maggie stood at the fence and watched him settle. She watched him drink long and slow, the water dripping from his muzzle as he raised his head. She watched him find the hay in the feeder and begin to eat, pulling mouthfuls from the bale with the rhythmic, unhurried efficiency of a healthy ruminant. She watched the limp. It was there in every step. But his eyes were calm, and his breathing was steady, and his body, apart from the one foot that hurt, was the body of a sound, well-managed, genetically valuable animal. Dex came and stood beside here. He did not say anything for a while. That was Dex. He had some of the same quietness in him as Walt, though it came from a different place. Walt's silence had been the silence of a man who was always observing, always processing, always building the internal model of the world that he relied on to make every decision. Dex's was the silence of a man who knew when not to talk. He could read a room the same way Walt could read a bull, and right now the room was telling him that his niece needed to stand at this fence and look at this animal and not be interrupted. After a while, he said, "You paid more than I thought you would." "I know. Your mom's going to have something to say about it." "I know. $3,600, that's almost everything he left you." Maggie did not answer. She was watching the bull. He had finished drinking and was working on the hay, now his jaw moving in the slow circular motion of a ruminant processing fiber, his eyes half closed in the contentment that comes from food and water and safety after a long, strange, stressful day. "Do you know what you're going to do?" Dex asked. "Yes," she said. That was all. Dex looked at her and he looked at the bull and he nodded once, a single dip of his chin that conveyed understanding and acceptance and perhaps something else, something that looked like the faintest trace of pride. And then he turned and walked back to the house. That evening, Maggie's mother called. Sandra Aldren was a practical woman. She worked as an office manager at a grain elevator in Gladbrook, a job she had held for 12 years, and she had the particular kind of practicality that develops in a person who has spent their adult life managing other people's paperwork and making sure the numbers add up. She loved her daughter. She had loved her father. She had agreed to let Maggie use the inheritance on one animal because she understood, even if she did not fully share the bond that existed between her daughter and her father around the work of cattle. But she had not agreed to watch her daughter spend nearly every dollar of that inheritance on a crippled bull that 90 experienced cattlemen had rejected. The conversation was short and difficult. Sandra's voice came through the phone sharp and strained, the voice of a woman who was trying to be calm and not entirely succeeding. $3,600, Maggie. Your grandfather left you that money. I know what he left me. He left you that money so you could do something smart with it, not throw it away on a lame bull that every buyer in the barn passed on. They didn't pass on him because he's worthless. They passed on him because they didn't look long enough. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens between a mother and a daughter when they are both right in their own way and neither one is going to say so. The pause was filled with all the things that Sandra wanted to say and did not say, and all the things that Maggie wanted to explain and could not explain, because the explanation lived in the notebook and in the hours of watching and in the 4-page entries she had written about this one bull, and none of that could be compressed into a phone conversation with a woman who loved her but did not understand what she was doing. "If that bull doesn't walk sound," Sandra said quietly, and her voice had dropped now from sharp to soft, from anger to something closer to fear, "you've lost everything he gave you. You understand that?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes, ma'am." Another pause, longer this time. The kind of pause where you can hear the other person breathing, and you can hear the house around them, and you can hear, if you listen carefully enough, the sound of a decision being made. Not a new decision, an old one. The decision to let go. The decision to stop trying to protect someone from something and to let them walk toward it on their own. "You sound just like him," Sandra said, and she hung up. Maggie stood in Dex's kitchen, holding the phone, and she looked out the window at the pen where the bull was standing in the last light of the October afternoon, his red coat dark against the gray sky, his white face turned toward the west where the sun was going down behind a bank of clouds, and she did not know if her mother had meant it as a compliment or a warning. She suspected it was both. She went to bed that night in the spare room at Dex's house, a small room with a single window that looked out over the feedlot and the fields beyond it. The room smelled like old wood and clean sheets and the faint, permanent odor of cattle that permeated everything within a mile of a working feedlot. She lay on the narrow bed with a notebook on the pillow beside her, the way a child might lay a favorite toy beside them for comfort, and she opened it to the last page her grandfather had written. "Everett Reduction Sale, October. Redwood 412 out of the 308 cow. Good line, sound pedigree, watch the feet." She had watched the feet. She had watched them more carefully than anyone in that barn. More carefully than Hank Purcell, who had spent 30 years buying cattle and had not bothered to look past the limp. More carefully than the 90 men in coveralls and feed store caps who had glanced at Pen 6 and shaken their heads and moved on. More carefully than Dwight Everett himself, who had listed the bull honestly, but had not spent the time to determine exactly what was wrong. She had watched the feet the way her grandfather had taught her to watch them, with patience, with precision, with the willingness to see what was actually there instead of what everyone else assumed was there. Tomorrow, Dr. Louise Kendrick would come. Tomorrow, they would find out if Maggie Aldren was right about what she had seen. She closed the notebook. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind move across the fields outside the window, carrying the smell of cold earth and dry corn, and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night, the low, comfortable sounds of animals that are warm and fed and safe. She was 12 years old. She had $460 left to her name. Everything else she had in the world was standing in a pen 50 yards from where she lay, 1,900 pounds of bone and muscle, and good genetics, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in the darkness, waiting for someone who had already decided to save him. Dr. Louise Kendrick arrived at 7:30 the next morning in a mud-splattered white truck and with a veterinary box bolted to the bed. The truck was a diesel, and it rattled up Dex's drive with the particular throaty idle of an engine that had 200,000 miles on it and was not finished yet. Dr. Kendrick climbed out and shut the door and stood in the gravel for a moment, stretching her back, rolling her neck, doing the small, physical recalibrations that large animal veterinarians learn to do between calls because their bodies take a beating that accumulates over the years like interest on a debt. She was in her late 40s, short-haired, no-nonsense, with the kind of face that communicated competence before she ever opened her mouth. She had been practicing large animal medicine in central Iowa for 22 years, which meant she had seen every injury infection, abscess fracture, tendon tear, hoof crack, joint, failure and structural collapse that a bovine skeleton could produce. She had seen them in barns and in pastures and in muddy feedlots and in the cabs of pickup trucks, where farmers sometimes called her from their phones while they stood over an animal that was down and described what they were seeing in the urgent clipped language of people who need help and need it now. She had been Walt Aldren's veterinarian for the last decade of his life. She had treated his cattle vaccinated, his calves helped him pull difficult births in the middle of winter nights, and sat with him in his kitchen afterward drinking coffee while the calf nursed in the barn and the snow came down outside. She had liked Walt. She had respected him in the way that veterinarians respect the stockmen who make their jobs easier by being observant and honest and calm. And when his daughter Sandra had called her and asked if she would come look at a bull that Maggie had bought, she had said yes immediately, not because she thought the bull was likely to be anything special, but because she owed Walt Aldren the courtesy of taking his granddaughter seriously. Dex met her at the gate. Maggie was already at the pen. She had been there since 6, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, with a notebook open in her lap, watching Redwood 412 move in the early morning light. The sun was coming up through a break in the clouds to the east, and the light was thin and golden, and it caught the bull's red coat and made it glow. He was calm. He had eaten well overnight. He stood at the feeder with his head low chewing, and the limp was there in every step. But his eyes were quiet, and his coat had the deep, even sheen of an animal whose body was sound everywhere except the one place it hurt. Dr. Kendrick climbed into the pen. She did not hurry. She moved with the measured, unhurried pace that experienced veterinarians use around large animals, not because they are not in a hurry, but because cattle respond to speed with anxiety, and anxiety makes everything harder. She ran her hands down the bull's front legs, starting at the shoulder, and moving down, feeling the muscle and the tendon and the joint beneath the hide, reading with her fingers what her eyes could not see. She lifted the left front hoof. She cradled it in her lap, bending at the waist in the practiced posture of someone who has held 1,000 hooves in her career, and she studied it. She turned it. She pressed the sole with her thumbs, working systematically from the toe to the heel, from the inside wall to the outside wall, watching the bull's face for the flinch that would tell her where the pain lived. It took her about 90 seconds. She found the abscess pocket on the medial side of the hoof wall, just above the sole, right where the white line meets the sensitive tissue beneath. It was the size of a marble. Dark, hot to the touch, pressurized. She could feel it through the horn of the hoof, a soft spot in what should have been hard, like finding a rotten board in a fence. She took the hoof knife from her kit. It was a small curved blade designed specifically for this kind of work, and she had used it so many times that it felt like an extension of her hand. She positioned the blade and she opened the abscess with a single precise cut. The drainage was immediate. A thick, dark fluid, part pus and part blood, welled up from the pocket and ran down the surface of the hoof and dripped onto the packed earth of the pen. The bull flinched once hard, his whole body tensing against the sudden release of pressure, the momentary sharp pain of the incision giving way almost immediately to the overwhelming relief of the pressure being gone. He stood still. Within 30 seconds, he shifted his weight to the left front for what was probably the first time in weeks. The relief was visible. You could see it in the way his whole body changed. The tension left his shoulders. His head came up. His breathing deepened. He was an animal whose world had just become dramatically less painful, and his body knew it before his brain did. Dr. Kendrick packed the cavity with antiseptic poultice. She wrapped the foot in a clean bandage, layering the booze and the tape with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone who could do this in her sleep. She straightened up. She wiped her hands on her coveralls. She stood there for a moment looking at the hoof she had just treated, and then she looked at Maggie. Maggie was standing at the rail with the notebook in her hands. She had not moved during the entire procedure. She had watched everything. She had watched with the same focused intensity that she had brought to the sale barn, the same quality of attention that Curtis Wainwright had noticed from across the coffee area, the same stillness that her grandfather had spent 12 years cultivating in her. Hoof abscess, Dr. Kendrick said. Just like you thought. Medial wall left front, good-sized pocket. It's been building for a while, probably 3 or 4 weeks. That's why the limp was so pronounced. Maggie nodded but did not speak. She was writing in the notebook. Clean it wrap, it keep him in a dry pen with fresh bedding. Change the wrap every other day. Watch for heat or swelling. 10 days, maybe 12. He'll walk sound. She paused. She looked at the girl more carefully, the way you look at someone when you realize they are not quite who you assume they were. She had come to Dex's place expecting to examine a bull and deliver a diagnosis to a child who was playing at being a cattlewoman. She was leaving with a different understanding. Your grandfather would have caught this in about 30 seconds, she said. There was respect in her voice. The quiet, understated respect of one professional acknowledging another. He taught me what to look for, Maggie said. I know he did. Dr. Kendrick smiled. It was a small smile, brief, the kind that carried weight behind it, the kind that said more than the words that accompanied it. He taught you well. The bill was $140. Maggie paid it from what was left of the inheritance. She now had $320 to her name and a bull and a pen and 11 days of waiting ahead of her. The waiting was the hardest part, not because she doubted the diagnosis. She had known what was wrong with the bull before she ever walked into the sale barn. She had known with a certainty that comes from studying something so carefully and for so long that the answer is not a guess, but a fact that simply has not been confirmed yet. The diagnosis was a formality, a confirmation of what she had already written in the notebook in her own handwriting beneath her grandfather's. The hardest part was everything around the waiting. Word travels fast in farming communities. It moves through feed stores and coffee shops, in the cabs of pickup trucks, the way weather moves across flat lands, steady and broad and impossible to stop. It travels on the lips of people who do not think of themselves as gossips, but who cannot resist the pull of an unusual story, a story that has all the ingredients of a good tale, a child a gamble, a lame bull, a number that makes you shake your head. By the end of the first week, most of Marshall County knew that Walt Aldren's 12-year-old granddaughter had paid $3,600 for a lame bull at the Everett retirement sale, and most of Marshall County had an opinion about it. The opinions were not kind, not malicious exactly, just the reflexive, ingrained skepticism of people who have worked with livestock their entire lives and who believe with the bone-deep certainty of long experience that they know what a lame bull is worth. A lame bull is worth meat price. That is the rule. That is the way it has always been. And anyone who pays double meat price for a lame bull, regardless of their age, regardless of their motivation, regardless of whether their dead grandfather's notebook told them to do it, is making a mistake. Some of them said it gently. They said it with the sympathetic headshake of people who mean well and genuinely feel bad for a child who has lost her inheritance on a bad bet. Some of them said it with the sharp, superior edge of people who enjoy being right about other people's mistakes. And some of them said it with the particular cruelty that small communities sometimes reserve for people who have done something that looks from the outside like foolishness. The cruelty that comes not from malice, but from the discomfort of seeing someone take a risk that you yourself would never take, and needing that risk to fail in order to validate your own caution. Hank Purcell told the story at a sale barn in Cedar Rapids 3 days after the auction. He told it in the coffee area, standing with a group of men he did business with regularly, and he told it as a comedy. The setup was the limp. The complication was the child. The punchline was the price. $3,600 for a bull that was headed for the kill floor. He told it with the timing and the inflection of a man who has told stories in sale barns for 30 years and knows exactly when to pause and when to deliver. He left out certain parts. He left out the part where he had been outbid. He left out the part where a 12-year-old girl that had looked at him across the ring with a steadiness that had made him put his number down. He left out the part where the barn had gone silent and the man from Grundy County had taken off his cap. He told the version that made him the sensible professional and her the naive child, and the men around him laughed, and the story left the building in that shape and traveled. It reached Gladbrook by midweek. Sandra heard it from a coworker at the grain elevator, a woman who told it with the gentle, concerned voice of someone delivering bad news about someone else's child. Sandra did not react. She thanked the woman and went back to her desk and sat there for a long time, looking at the spreadsheet on her computer screen without seeing any of the numbers. She did not tell Maggie, but Maggie knew anyway. Children always know when the adults around them are carrying a weight they are trying to hide. They feel it in the air. They hear it in the slight changes of voice and behavior that adults think are invisible, but are to a child who is paying attention as loud as a shout. Maggie went to the pen every morning before school. She left the house at 6 while it was still dark, and she walked across Dex's property to the pen with a flashlight in one hand and the notebook in the other. She changed the wrap on the bull's hoof. She cleaned the drainage site with the antiseptic solution, working carefully gently the way her grandfather had taught her to work with animals with respect for the pain and patience for the process. She watched the bull walk. She recorded the angle of his stride, the depth of the limp, the subtle daily changes that told her the abscess was draining properly and the infection was clearing and the hoof wall was beginning to heal. On day 4, the limp was noticeably better. The stride was longer. The hesitation was shorter. The bull was putting more weight on the left front, testing it, trusting it, learning to use it again, the way a person with a healing injury learns to use the injured limb cautiously at first and then with growing confidence. On day 7, he was putting full weight on the left front for the first time. He crossed the pen without favoring it. Not perfectly, not with the fluid, even stride of a fully sound animal, but close. Close enough that Maggie, who had been watching this bull every day for a week, and before that had watched him 3 times at the Everett place, and before that had studied every note her grandfather had written about hoof abscesses and recovery times and the specific measurable markers of healing, could see that the trajectory was right. The bull was healing. The abscess was resolving. The foot was coming back. On day 9, he walked across the pen without any visible limp at all. Maggie stood at the fence and watched him move back and forth, and she wrote in her notebook the same way her grandfather had written in the same format with the same precision, using the same structure he had used for 31 years. Date, animal, observation, conclusion. Day 9, Redwood 412, full weight left front, stride even, head level, no compensation, sound. She underlined the last word twice. On day 11, Dr. Kendrick came back. She parked her truck in Dex's drive and walked to the pen, and she watched the bull. She watched him walk from one end of the pen to the other. She watched him turn, which loads the hooves differently and can reveal residual pain that straight line walking might mask. She watched him stop and start. She called him toward her with a low sound, the kind of sound that cattle respond to, and he came to her willingly, walking with the heavy, even-footed, unhurried stride of a bull who is in no pain at all. She climbed into the pen. She lifted the hoof. She inspected the site. The pocket had closed. The tissue was healing cleanly. There was no heat, no swelling, no drainage, no sign of recurring infection. She set the foot down and she straightened up, and she looked at Maggie, who was standing at the rail with the notebook in her hands, and she nodded once. "He's sound," she said. "Clean bill of health. You can breed him, sell him, whatever you want. That bull is right." Maggie had already made the call. A month before the Everett sale, while she was still researching Redwood 412's pedigree, she had found a listing on a Hereford breeder's form from a man named Martin Selway, who owned a ranch near Conrad, about 40 minutes east of Gladbrook. Selway was looking for a Hereford bull with specific bloodlines. He wanted the 308 cow line. He had been looking for 6 months and had not found what he wanted because the 308 cow line was rare, and the bulls that carried it tended to sell quickly and for premium prices when they were sound. Sound was the key word. A bull from the 308 line with a hoof abscess that made him look lame was to a buyer like Selway worthless. A bull from the 308 line that had been diagnosed, treated, cleared by a veterinarian, and confirmed sound was worth what the genetics said he was worth. Maggie had written down Selway's phone number in her notebook and had not called him. Not yet. Not until she was sure. Calling too early before the bull was confirmed sound would have been a mistake. It would have introduced uncertainty into a transaction that needed to be clean. It would have forced her to sell potential instead of proof, and Maggie, who had learned negotiation the same place she had learned everything else from a quiet man who never oversold and never underprepared, understood that the difference between potential and proof was the difference between a maybe and a yes. The day after Dr. Kendrick cleared the bull, Maggie called. She was sitting in Dex's kitchen at the table where Dex ate his meals and paid his bills and read the livestock reports that came in the mail, and she dialed the number she had written down 2 months earlier. The phone rang 3 times. "Selway," the voice said, flat Midwestern, unhurried. "Mr. Selway, my name is Maggie Aldren. I'm calling about your listing on the Hereford Forum. You're looking for a bull out of the 308 cow line." There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when a person is recalibrating their expectations because the voice on the phone is not the voice they were expecting. It was too young, too high, too clearly belonging to someone who should not, by any conventional measure, be calling about breeding stock. "That's right," Selway said carefully. "I have one. Everett Redwood 412, registered, papered, out of the 308 cow, 6 years old. He had a hoof abscess that's been treated and resolved. I have a clean vet report from Dr. Louise Kendrick. He's sound." Another pause, longer this time. "Where did you get him?" "Everett retirement sale, Marshalltown, 3 weeks ago." "And you're saying he's sound?" "Yes, sir. Dr. Kendrick confirmed it yesterday. I can have her call you if you'd like." There was a third pause, and in it, Maggie could hear the calculation happening on the other end of the line. She could hear a man who had been looking for this exact bull for 6 months, trying to reconcile the quality of the animal with the age of the voice that was offering it to him. She waited. She did not rush him. She did not oversell. She sat at the kitchen table, and she waited with the same patience she had shown at the fence at the sale ring at every point in this process where the next step required someone else to arrive at a conclusion that she had already reached. "I'd like to come see him," Selway said. "Yes, sir, anytime." He drove out to Dex's place on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the sale. He arrived in a clean pickup truck, the kind of truck that tells you a man takes care of his equipment, and he got out and he stood in the drive for a moment and he looked around. He was tall, in his mid-50s, deliberate in his movements, the kind of breeder who does not buy an animal without putting his hands on it. He had been raising registered Herefords for 28 years, and he had the quiet, appraising demeanor of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for and will not be rushed in looking for it. He spent 20 minutes with Redwood 412. He checked his feet. He lifted each hoof and inspected it, spending the longest time on the left front where the abscess had been. He checked the bull's conformation, running his hands over the shoulders and the loin and the hindquarters, feeling the muscle depth, the bone structure, the balance of the body. He watched him walk. He watched him stand. He watched him from both sides and from behind. He read the vet report. He studied the pedigree papers. Then he looked at Maggie. She was standing at the fence where she had been standing for the entire 20 minutes. She had not said a word. She had not tried to point out the bull's qualities or direct Selway's attention to the thing